بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful. It is indeed a pleasure to greet you all in greetings of peace. Again, this Sunday here on our course together. I'm going to forego some of the introductory remarks that I normally would, because I like all of us, as I think you've learned by now, to always be relating what we learn in class, the subject matter of our course, to what's going on around us in the news or wherever it happens in our communities. And there's so much going on this week in that regard. We have Juneteenth, we have critical race theory, we have many other things going on. If time allows, inshallah, I'd like to come back to those, including a very excellent question posed at the end of last class, where there was no time to address it, by Brother I.A. Moss or Sister I.A. Moss, which we will get to either today or in next class. But first of all, I'd like to address this class, the subject of what we want to accomplish and share today, and to put this class, which is at the heart of our course, 5 sessions, session 3, right in the middle. In our first session, you recall that we established the 1492, a New World Order, Africans being brought to the New World more than 500 years ago. And the great history, as well as history of oppression, that the people, are Africans and African descended people, have experienced. We also had the Age of Enlightenment in the second class, and how that led to a further change in the world and led to the birth of the nation we're in now, the United States of America, and what that meant. 5 revolutions across the world within a 50-year period, stimulated, influenced by this so-called Age of Enlightenment. Today's class, really at the heart, because now we're going to work with how this enlightenment affected the birth of this nation, and particularly 3 documents and 12 movements. But the emphasis is going to be on the 3 documents: the Independence, Declaration of Independence, U.S. Constitution, and further the Gettysburg Address, delivered before the end of the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln. So with that context, that is in the middle also of the 2 classes that come afterward. Next week, we will cover the Civil War and reparations, question mark, as well as the role of the USCT, U.S. United States Colored Troops, as well as 40 acres and a mule. This was the first attempt at reparations, which is worthy of discussion. Reconstruction, the Black Codes, Jim Crow, all that leading up to the present time from the Civil War. In our last class, then, we will have our summary and our conclusions, all the questions that you have had, and will present before class 5 and even some during class 5, we will treat in our summary and conclusions. Key terms, key sources, key dates. But as we are in the heart now, why is it at the heart? Why are these 3 documents the heart of this course and perhaps our nation and its history. If we think of our own deen, our own way of life, the source of our belief and our understanding of life and its purpose and our obligations to our Lord and to each other, it is all based on one document, now written down, in fact, during the life of our Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him. Well, likewise, this nation, United States of America, bases its birth and how the nation should lead its life, its legal and social life in particular, on documents, especially the Declaration of Independence, which defined its identity, and the Constitution, which spelled out its legal identity, especially as a group and also as individuals. So our question, of course, is how did Africans and Africa's descendants play a role, or how did they not play a role in the formation of these documents? If we look carefully, we're soon to discover that much of the answer to this question has never been discussed, certainly not fully discussed in our schoolwork, from grade school through middle school through high school, and maybe at some college period it was discussed. But now is our opportunity to broach these questions and give us the tools for further study if we want to unlock these secrets and reveal what these documents have to offer us and the context of how these documents were created. So, how did we figure or not figure? How were we mentioned explicitly, or how were we left out purposely or unintentionally? Let's go to our first slide for today. Towards the understanding of the experience of Africans and their descendants in the Americas, 3 documents, 12 movements. Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson in Congress, July 4th, 1776. Why, that date's just around the corner. If we jump to 2021, we want to know, what does July 4th mean for us, and what has it meant for the nation? Do the origin and words of this document relate at all to the protests and demonstrations that erupted here and worldwide following the death of George Floyd? What insights, if any, can such a comparison provide in either direction? And now the famous, often quoted beginning of the Declaration of Independence, penned by Thomas Jefferson, 3rd president, and at that point, before we had a president, the declaration of our independence, U.S. independence, the colonies' independence from England. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes. We have to look at this language. This language is over 200 years old. If we're not used to reading historical documents, they may not be readily understood for the way they use language, let alone for the words or selection of words that they're using. So let's just take a little bit, a moment or two to look at this language as we get a feel for it. When in the course of human events, well, that should be clear. That are all events that affect mankind. It becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands. Bands are like bonds. Bands are ties that join, and to assume among the powers, that is to take on, to assume or take on, like you assume responsibility, take on among the powers of the earth. We know these, especially today, as the great powers. These are the powers that are most often in the news, such as the United States and Russia and China and many other nations, but France, especially Europe, and that was the case at this point in time. It was England, the English Empire, British Empire. It was France, also beginning empire. It was the Netherlands. It was mostly the European powers who were the powers of the earth at that time, 1776. And equal station, separate and equal station. Well, this stands out right away. Separate and equal station. Station is where you stand. Where are you located in this hierarchy, in this listing, in this group of powers? Separate and equal station. You've been part of one. Now you're talking about separating, but at an equal level. Why, of course, as African Americans or descendants of Africa, we know that term in U.S. history, separate but equal. And we know it was everything but separate, everything separate, but nothing of equal. That is part of our history that we will be covering in more detail next time. But we see an echo here of that same language in a founding document, but used slightly differently. Not to talk about the relationship between races in the United States, but to talk about the relationship between the English colonies, not yet the United States, declaring their independence and telling you that they are planning to assume equal, separate and equal station or position to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Very important line here. To which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Here is a big hint. Here is a big indication that at the time this document was written, at the time this nation was born, there was a different and much more prominent place for God in the mix. God is mentioned early on, as we can see, and nature with a capital N. It's almost like another way of referring to God. Nature with a capital N. All those documents we were talking about from the Enlightenment, remember, influenced this document. And so science, the whole idea of science as independent from religious faith was just beginning to develop. So nature, yes, nature's God. They're still important. There's not a clear distinction. They are, if not one and the same, closely bound. And we must appeal to them, thought Thomas Jefferson, thought all those who contributed to the framing of this document, if we're going to justify what we are about to do. Equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. This is where our authority comes from. Nature and nature's God. They entitle us. They give us the right and the authority to what we're asking for, what we're demanding. A decent respect to the opinion of mankind requires that they should declare the causes. Finally, they end here. ... of course, means there's a lot more to come. We only have so much room on one slide and so much time in 1 hour. But the important thing to note is they feel it necessary. Jefferson and the framers, the so-called founding fathers, feel it necessary to give the opinions or to give the causes, to give the argument, to state the argument that authorizes them to declare this independence. Continuing with the declaration, are the points here stronger and clearer than the ones presented in the intro? Would we argue for social justice using these same points today, or would we take a different approach? This is a question for you to ask yourself as we're proceeding here. We can't interact directly at the present time, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be following, that we shouldn't be following this as closely as possible, interrogating, asking ourselves questions as we react to what's coming in front of us. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That means you can't take them away. That means the Creator gave us these rights. Why, certainly, we can relate to this in Islam, because throughout Quran, throughout our tradition, we are given certain rights and responsibilities by our Creator, and no one else can take them away. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Why, you must know these words. You hear them often, whether they're in some piece of literature, some movie, whether they are in the memory banks that you remember from school. But some of this wording you will remember. And now we have the opportunity to look back at our present stage of experience, at our present level of understanding. And remember, there's something in here for us, something in here important to understanding how this country was founded and what our role in it either was or should have been or was not. Carter G. Woodson, we've mentioned Carter G. Woodson, and we've mentioned Elijah Muhammad in Message to the Black Man in America, and Carter G. Woodson in the Miseducation of the Negro, putting emphasis, and especially Carter G. Woodson, emphasis on the study of these documents and how some of the schools, some of the power structure did not want these documents in the schools that were being established for the freed, enslaved people after the Civil War. Didn't want us to have access. We have to ask ourselves a question: why? Why is that important? Why should we now take advantage of the opportunity we have afforded to us to look at these documents for ourselves? Just as our dean tells us to read Quran for ourselves and know for ourselves what's in it, to be responsible for it, we as citizens should be reading these documents to find out what is in it. If someone says something that's not in it, claims it is, we'll have an understanding of that. All right. So once again, we get the Creator mentioned with a capital C. Then the next point, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. Rectitude is like standing erect, upright, standing up straight. This is a word, again, translated into English that we know, upright, standing straight. And here we have it among appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. So again, it's not just these world powers. We're saying that our authority, Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers, the framers of this document, are saying that their authority appeals to the supreme judge. Why, now we have the word Supreme Court. We have the term Supreme Court. That's the highest court that you can go to. The same language before there was a Supreme Court is taking shape, is being selected for this part, this portion of the Declaration of Independence, appealing to the supreme judge. And we understand this to be God, another reference to God, who's the only one or the highest one to be able to judge the rectitude, whether we're right or wrong, whether these are moral or upright or correct. And finally, and for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, again, with a P. We can get many meanings for providence, but divine providence, protection of divine providence, this might be another way for saying the will of God. With a firm reliance on the protection of the will of God, divine providence, we can see that God is being appealed to all through this document. So once again, we're asking ourselves, wait a minute, it says all men are created equal. Was that referring to us or not? Much of the language of the history of our struggles goes back to this phrase, to this language in this document and others. All men are created equal. Was that us? Or was that not us as Africans or descendants of Africans brought by force to this country, but even by the time of the writing of this document here for more than 100 years, maybe going on 150 years. That's a long time. That's several generations. Finally, continuing. On the list of grievances against Britain, do you note any parallel to protests of 2020? Now, obviously, you don't have that list in front of you yet, but this is starting off. Can you restate this grievance using today's language or terms you've heard in news reporting to express the modern version of this complaint? This is another example of going back over 200 years and seeing grievances listed, much as we see grievances listed today. We've seen grievances listed in the 12 movements, beginning from the abolition of slavery movement, the Niagara movement, the Marcus Garvey movement, the Nation of Islam, the Black Panther Party, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Black Power movement before it, and many other movements listing complaints. And so now we have in likewise manner complaints being listed. This is part of the argument building. And bullet point here is for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. Quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. We don't use that word so much in this way as we used to. That is decades or centuries ago. Quartering, maybe if you're in the Army, you might recognize this though. If you're in the armed services or even in military, paramilitary groups, police or militias, National Guard, you might recognize what quartering is. Quartering is like your quarters, where you live. Quartering means setting up with a place to live. Large bodies of armed troops among us for protecting them by a mock trial. What kind of a mock trial is it? Making fun of something or making a mockery of something, meaning it's not real. It's not accomplishing its true purpose. We have that term used in law schools today. They still have mock court, training the lawyers. It's not real court yet. It's a court in a law school that's set up to practice. But a mock trial, in this case, is not set up for practice. It's set up in a way that it makes a mockery of, it's supposed to be a real trial, but it's not. A mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. Well, we saw a lot of this before the death of George Floyd, and unfortunately, far too much even after the death of George Floyd. And what does that mean? It means that there are large bodies of armed men set up and living quartered, but who are protected from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. In this case, not the American colonists of the British Empire, but the descendants of African peoples here in these United States. So look at the parallel between these grievances. We have seen the complaints time after time. It's been nearly impossible to get any kind of a conviction against a police person. Only recently, here in Chicago and Minnesota, have we received a conviction, notice, particularly in a major court case against a murder committed against, or alleged murder committed against inhabitants. So this bullet point is picked out. The language, the situation is far too close. All right, that's from then to now. We will see how this comparison between Americans, subjects of the British Empire living in the 13 colonies of what was to become the United States, even before the Declaration of Independence. This contradiction, all men created equal. Well, what about the descendants of African? What about the enslaved peoples? Are they created equal also? And so many times, whether it's in connection with what we're learning in history in school, whether it's in everyday argument, whether it's in any forum, well, that was then. That was 200 years ago. That was just the way the world was then. That's why we have to dig deeper. That's why we have to look at this history. That's why we have to look at these documents. That's why we have to look at related documents, context, like this one. Thomas Paine. What's the connection to the Declaration of Independence? Thomas Paine was the principal influencer of Thomas Jefferson through the Enlightenment and through his writings and through his personal contact in the United States. He was born in Great Britain, born in England, came here as an adult, as a young man. He was fired up by the ideas of the Enlightenment. He came here in 1775. That's only a year before the Declaration of Independence was written. But what was the first thing he wrote when he got here? It wasn't something that related directly to the colonists. The first document he wrote and had published was not about the American colonist situation. It was about the descendants of Africans and the descendants of Africans here in the colonies, recognizing the situation that existed. Let's see what he had to say. What is the hypocrisy Paine is trying to reveal in bullet number 1 below? What is the irony? Irony is the opposite of what is expected. He is pointing out in number 2. All right, let's look at number 1. With what consistency or decency they complain so loudly of attempts to enslave them. He's referring here to the American colonists, complaining against King George of England, while they, the same colonists, hold so many hundred thousands in slavery. He's referring now to Africans and their descendants, and annually enslave many thousands more without any pretense of authority or claim upon them. So with what consistency or decency they complain so loudly of attempts to enslave them. This is from his pamphlet, African Slavery in America. He then goes on to say, how just, how suitable to our crime is the punishment with which Providence threatens us. We have enslaved multitudes and shed much innocent blood in doing it, and now are threatened with the same. He's making an open comparison between the situation of the colonists who are crying foul, crying wrong, crying no, we won't accept it, to the King of England for enslaving them. Their word. They call it like slavery. You're taking our rights away. Inalienable rights. These are rights given to us by our Creator. All of us are created equal. You're taking these rights. You have no authority, according to Providence with a P, according to the Supreme Judge with a capital SJ, according to our Creator with a capital C. Yet, Paine is identifying with his new home. He says, we have enslaved multitudes. Well, England was a part of that, and shed much innocent blood in doing it, and now are threatened with the same. We're being threatened as Americans, European Americans, British Americans, colonists. And while other evils are confessed and bewailed, why not this especially and publicly? Other evils, what the king is doing to us, we're confessing, we're bewailing, we're complaining, we're crying out for justice. And Paine says, why not this especially and publicly? Let's be out in the open with it. Than which no other vice, if all others, has brought so much guilt on the land. In his words, in his opinion, in his observation, this is a guilt on the conscience of the American people. This is his observation. We would have to go further to examine this. Is he right? Well, we know he was in a position to see. I'm sure there were others who disagreed. Some agreed publicly in part. None went as far as this to make this comparison, saying, no, this is not what we should be doing if we're complaining about the same thing. Well, we could examine this, of course, in more depth to examine how he pursues this argument. The important thing to know at this stage is before he began a very strong argument, wasn't the strongest ever, and helped convince not only Thomas Jefferson, but he wrote a pamphlet, Common Sense, which was very influential in preparing the American people, the British colonists, to accept this argument of the Declaration of Independence. Remember, opinion was divided, and he helped sway the day. So he was very much in favor of the American people, throwing off, as the ideas of enlightenment suggested they should, and establish a democracy, establish a rule by a group and not by a king with divine right. So prelude to the Declaration, number 2, the first prelude was his African slavery in America, condemned roundly. Common Sense, this is the one you'll read about in history books. You won't read about the previous one. This one you will read. From Common Sense of Monarchy and Hereditary Succession. What are the false distinctions Paine refers to here? And what are some of the false distinctions, mention any key terms, that social justice advocates are protesting today? We're always looking at whatever history we look at. How does this relate to today? Strong relation, weak relation, no relation. Most of these documents, if we're looking carefully, have a strong relation. But there is another and great distinction for which no truly natural or religious reason can be assigned, and that is the distinction of men into kings and subjects, dividing men into kings and their subjects. So all of the Americans were known as subjects of the British Empire, subjects of King George III. male and female are the distinctions of nature, good and bad, the distinctions of heaven, but how a race of men came into the world so exalted above the rest and distinguished like some new species is worth inquiring into, and whether they are the means of happiness or of misery to mankind. Yes, it might take us a reading or two, maybe three, to get through the language, but most of these words we will know. We haven't necessarily seen them used in this way, but this was the common usage of language. Although we recognize Thomas Paine's abilities as an orator and a persuader. But he's talking about kings and subjects. Should there be a divine right of kings? Is there a divine right of kings? That the world should be divided into kings and subjects. Kings have all the power. Subjects have practically none. Why, of course, that is suggesting a comparison, especially when we see the word race, a group, sometimes a group related by blood, how a race of men come into the world so exalted above the rest, so placed much high above the rest, and distinguished like some new species. Is this the European? Are these the European colonists and empires of the day, kicked off by Columbus in 1492, as we said, or even before? Whether they are the means of happiness or of misery to mankind? Well, most of the subjects are going to say they're the source of misery, not the source of happiness. But this was part of his argument that the colonists accepted and made for themselves. But now when we read it, and some who read it then, and we have to ask ourselves the question, was Thomas Paine himself one of those who read it then, making the same comparison that we suggest now? A race of men, Europeans, empire builders, who enslave some as if they are a different species. Is that something that they were aware of? I think Thomas Paine was definitely aware of it. That's why he wrote that document on African slavery before he wrote Common Sense. American Crisis. This is the third series of pamphlets he wrote. Number one, December 1776. His work was not done. Once the Declaration of Independence was written, his support for the colonists was just beginning. Once you make a declaration, you've got to back it up. We found out last week that war to back it up took about 8 years. Thomas Paine was still active. His pen was still working. Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then is there not such a thing as slavery upon earth? Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can belong only to God. He's saying, you're taking on too much power. He's saying, you claim as king, as the empire, that you can not only tax us without representation, but we have the right to make decisions for you in all cases whatsoever. Unlimited power, power so unlimited can belong only to God. Once again, God is invoked. How do these documents shed light on 1776 or speak to 2020? Here is a fraction that lives on long before its time, long before its day as part of the Constitution of the United States. The Constitutional Convention of 1787. This is the next step. After the war was won, after the Declaration was written, accepted, and fought for, they had to draft a constitution or body of laws. And this was done in 1787, between 3 and 4 years after the war was done and some preliminary organizing was done. A convention with all 13 colonies represented came together. Will slavery continue when the former 13 colonies become 13 states under the first U.S. Constitution? Well, that's a question. Some of us never even asked this question. We didn't even realize it was a question. But yes, those who say the United States has a chance, has an opportunity, has strong ideals, they have a foundation in truth. There have been several moments, very critical moments in U.S. history when the U.S. had a chance, the legislatures and the people had a chance to examine and decided which way they would go, particularly when it comes to slavery and the differentiation made, not only in slavery, but in all forms of treatment of Africans and their descendants in this nation. So in this convention, they did look at this question. And many opened the question and said, we need to think about this. Is this the kind of a country we want? Is this something we want to be a part of our ideals or certainly our practices? A heated argument and debate, then a vote. All right. How many voted in favor? You fill in the blank. Write your own blank, you fill it in. And how many against slavery? The total is 13. Total is 13. All right. Write your number down before we go to the next slide. Let's see how close you come. See how you've been following. What do you think is going to happen? And then, were you close? One state prevails over 12 others. 12 voted to abolish slavery. No more slavery. Now that we have a constitution, now that we're going to be a country separate from England, separate and equal among the nations of the world, no more slavery. 12 out of 13 said no more slavery. South Carolina's threat to walk out. Disclaimer, my family was born in South Carolina. My father's family and much of my family was born in South Carolina. And none of us identified with this part, believe me. South Carolina's threat to walk out guarantees the continuation of enslavement of Africans and their descendants in the new nation, the United States of America. Imagine that. How can 12 states, Virginia, New York, they weren't states then, of course. Well, they were on the path from becoming colonies to states. They were states because they won the war. But imagine that, 12, all of them but one. And one decided to vote. They were supposed to vote, majority, no. One threatened to walk out. And so we have the result we have. 3/5 of a person is the compromise value assigned to enslaved individuals who have no rights themselves, but now provide an added fractional population used to determine the number of delegates each slave-holding state may send to the House of Representatives in Congress. No, they weren't representing that population of Africans and their descendants, the enslaved people, but they were helping to build additional representation for the plantation owners that owned them as enslaved people. So there's another irony here. There's another irony here. But the important thing to remember here is the United States did have a debate. 12 states voted for abolition. Maybe not started out with 12. There was heated debate, and some had to convince others. but all were convinced but one. But somehow one managed to sway the others and said, if you don't change this vote, we will not be a part of it. And so they won. All right, before the Constitution, legal framework for chattel slavery and dehumanization. This is the context that created the differences that we began to see. And this was the legal basis for what came to be known in our time as institutionalized racism. It was institutionalized beginning in 1660. Although we may not have called it that, we are only recognizing it with specific language that is a way to refer to the facts and situation that we describe here. 1660, Virginia leads the way, declares people of African descent servants for life, declares that any child of an African descended mother inherits the enslaved status of his or her mother, outlaws marriage between people of African descent and whites. In 1667, decrees that converting to Christianity would not alter the legal status of an enslaved person. They had to make a law about that. There was some question about that. And then they decided it the way they did. The Gettysburg Address. Finally, this is the document probably after the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, which is most identified with the beliefs, the system of government, and the pride of the United States as having a form of government different and more representative than others. How does the language of the first sentence of this document compare to the language and issues explicit, that means clear and out in the open, and implicit, or just implied or hinted at, of previous documents shown? These are those words. fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. There are those words, all men are created equal, echoed by Abraham Lincoln, echoes the words of Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence in his Gettysburg Address in 1863, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in the middle of the Civil War. Then we have the Reconstruction amendments following the end of the Civil War, changing the Constitution. 1865, 13th Amendment. This is the documentary, title of the documentary by Ava DuVernay, which is part of this course's resources, that abolished slavery, leaving, unfortunately, some loopholes, which we'll find out about. Ratified in 1868, the 14th Amendment, guaranteed equal protection of the laws to all. And ratified in 1870, this is only 6 years before the end of the Reconstruction period. 15th Amendment, guaranteed the right to vote. Now, this is maybe the first one that you can connect to what's going on right now. All over the country, states are creating rights which abrogate or reduce the right to vote. This was ratified in 1870, but we have a whole history of 100 years and more where this was subverted, and now we have a new wave of subversion, as some might observe it or call it, going on in the courts today. This is history we should know to see where we have come from, what is new, what is not new, and how can we better forge a future based on knowledge. Abolition. Men talk of the Negro problem. There is no Negro problem. The problem is whether the American people have honesty enough, loyalty enough, honor enough, patriotism enough to live up to their Constitution. This is before those amendments. This is 1852, before the Civil War, by Frederick Douglass. Speech he made on July 4th, coming up. No, that was a long time ago. But July 4th is coming up. And every year, especially those who don't feel we are getting fair treatment, equal treatment, and all of the rights guaranteed by the Constitution, have to question, ask questions, which should be asked about the Constitution, about our history. Frederick Douglass, 1818 to 1895. He's an escaped slave, abolitionist, advisor to U.S. presidents. And he was speaking out. He made more of an impact and reached more people on this subject probably than anyone until the time of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who had the media, mass media, at his access. Nation of Islam. Let's go now back to Elijah Muhammad, who wrote in Message to the Black Man, published in 1965, "The worst kind of crime has been committed against us, for we were robbed of our desire to even want to think and do for ourselves." Robert H. Kinzer and Edward Sagarin, in their book, The Negro in American Business, on page 81, this is all in Message to the Black Man, quoted. I didn't pull this out myself. I found it in Message to the Black Man in America. States that the history of America would be different today if the slaves freed from bondage had been given, in addition to the 3 amendments to the Constitution. These are the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, 15, referred to here in Message to the Black Man. The famous 40 acres and a mule. Why, if you've ever watched a Spike Lee movie, you've seen the 40 acres and a mule at the beginning and or the end of the movie. This is the name of his production company, evoking this history. The slave master passed laws limiting the so-called Negro in land ownership, or limiting the areas in which such purchases or even rentals could be made. Why, today we call this redlining. There's a long history of it with a more modern name, but this goes back many years, many decades. Are you not left restricted to the poorer sections the slave master is abandoning throughout America? This is written at the time of the 60s and refers at least to time between the 30s and the 60s. And of course, we know it's referring to a much longer time, before and after 1965. So we have, if we know our history, connections to make by our thinkers, by our activists, by our religious leaders, all those who are making observations. And this is within our power to claim, to grasp for ourselves. And when we get together with family, with friends, with members of organizations that we belong to, with like-minded people, or people who are not of like mind, we should be talking to them also. We should be looking at what they write and say also, because in the final analysis, we have the same creator. We are all human beings. We should be striving to work together, resisting oppression, but striving to work together as far as possible, and convincing, persuading someone through knowledge. And here we see places where we can find knowledge and share with each other. We know that Allah is the best knower. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, may he be glorified, has given us the tools that we need, has given us the mind, and has given us the heart to search out the truth. and then share it with each other, discuss it with each other. So let's work to continue. Let's see if we have any questions from this week. We have a great question from last week. And brother or sister Imos, I'm going to beg just a little bit more time to give you a full and more just, more complete answer to your question, because it deserves that. But I'm going to give it just a moment to reflect on what we just shared together, because part of the way these documents were created was through reflection. Thomas Jefferson did not pen this document in a day or a night or a week or even a month. It took a lot of contemplation and a lot of sharing, framing this knowledge with other of the framers of these documents. People like Thomas Paine, which weren't part of the United States at all, although part of the same empire, part of the same community of peoples, and also, most importantly, part of someone who shared the desire for liberty and willingness to fight for liberty, whether it was with the pen or with other means. And he supported and sustained and encouraged the troops, the framers of the institution, all involved. So we need to reflect on our search for knowledge, get that knowledge, reflect on it, and use it to move forward. So with knowledge, we have power. And we always seek the blessings of Allah to use it properly, to have light on that knowledge so that we can make good decisions and create a better future for ourselves. I look forward to meeting with you again next week. Remember, next week we will cover the Civil War, and we will cover the 4 episodes of Henry Louis Gates' documentary on the Civil War and Reconstruction. We will look at Ava DuVernay's documentary. We will use these to inform our discussion and our presentation. So feel free to search out your own resources. We have so many things going on around us that relate to this history, and we can understand what's going on around us better if we look at this history. So with that, if we have any questions that may have come in the last minute, we will group them together and we will give them a higher priority. This is the heart of the course, and so please take time to reflect on the birth of this nation and some facts that we learn about it that are not as well known as some other facts, and put those in the mix, because we played, as African peoples, descendants of African peoples, a very prominent role, both expressed and not expressed, in the framing of our documents, the direct Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. I greet you in the words of peace. Assalamu alaikum.